Okay, this is Papa, part 2, I guess, of the GP35 coverage for initially for Weston, my 4-year-old grandson, and at part 1 I got some notes of some things I need to point out to him. We covered the sand dome, and you're probably wondering, well, why are you putting sand in a locomotive, Weston? In case you don't know, you got to carry sand in the locomotive to put it gets sprayed down on the wheels down here right in front of the lead axle, in front of these wheels that are trying to pull the locomotive so that the wheels don't slip. When you're under a heavy load trying to get started, you're not putting sand out all the time, but when you're trying to get started or you're on slippery rail or whatever to keep the wheels from spinning, which is called wheel slip, you put sand down because you got steel wheels on steel rails, and when you put those two together, it's not like rubber tires on a car. You don't get the wheels could spin. All right, and we'll get into it's called wheel slip. So we have sand we put in here that gets sprayed down when the engineer turns the sanders on. The sand gets sprayed down in front of the lead wheels on each truck. The trucks, when I say trucks, I don't mean the trucks that drive on the road. The set of axles on a locomotive are installed on what's called a truck. On a GP35, of course, as you know, this is a 4-axle. There are 2 trucks, 2 axles on each truck. This is a truck up here, and this is a truck back here. We'll get back to that later some more, but then I also wanted to cover the part about the front and back of the locomotive. All right, so how do you know which is the front and which is the back, and why can't he run backwards on a train? Why does he have to have another locomotive MU'd to him, or does he like to have another locomotive MU'd to him pointing the other way? Well, first of all, he can run backwards, of course, as you know, but I talked about him not being able to see with the high hood. Can you imagine how hard it is for them to see when they're running long hood forward? Okay, this is the short hood end. This is the long hood end. All right, and which is the front and which is the back? Just because this is the short hood end and you already, pretty much figured out that this is the front, you never want to assume which end is the front. If you ever want to know, if you're ever wondering which is the front end of the locomotive, and this is very important, it may sound silly to some of you, but that's the front of the locomotive that you might think is the front is not always the front of the locomotive. And how you find out for sure which is the front, there's an F, it stands for front, on every locomotive on the front end. It's right here on this section, this plate that runs along the side of the locomotive. There's a big F right there. And when you see that, if you're ever wondering which is the front, and you always want to make sure you know which way is the front because it can be a safety concern, you tell the F is on that end of the locomotive. If you look back here, you won't find an F because that's not the front, that's the back. The front is right here where the F is. That's the front of the locomotive, and that will tell you. And why is that important? Because when the conductor is on the radio and he calls the engineer on the radio and says, "Okay, pull ahead," the engineer's going to pull ahead, means forward. The way the locomotive that he's sitting in, that he's driving from, he's going to go forward from that locomotive. The other locomotives can be turned which way. His can be turned, even if his is turned the other way, if the train is hooked on this end. Okay? Say the train cars are all back here on the front of his locomotive. For whatever reason, sometimes it happens, and he's driving from the locomotive from this locomotive, and the conductor or the dispatcher tells him to go forward. He's going to go toward the F, forward. He's going to move his locomotive forward, even though he's shoving on the train backwards. So that's why it's ever so important, safety-wise, to know which end of the locomotive is forward end of the locomotive. All right, the other thing, I think we covered everything that wanted to get on that. So on the other part one, we left off with the MU cable plug right here. All right, this is when you hook locomotives together, when you make up a consist or a lash up, of course you want to couple them up together. You know about that part. You open the knuckle and you hook them together. All right, but you also have to hook some other stuff together, and that other stuff is the electric plug. It's a big, heavy cord that you plug in each locomotive, so the locomotives can be controlled electrically from the lead locomotive, and the other locomotives will get the electrical signals telling them to what to do. So also you have air in a locomotive, compressed air, like pressurized air, like when you blow, you know, like that, you know, you blow air. Well, locomotives make up a whole bunch of air that they store with they make it with a compressor, and they store it in reservoir tanks, and I'll show you where those are later. But anyway, that air is part of controlling the locomotive too, and that air has to be hooked up to the other MU'd engines with these hoses down here. All right, we're going to go over those now. There are basically 4 air lines that connect locomotives together. All right, and when it comes to the train cars, there's only one airline. That airline, that's the main airline in a train, is called the brake pipe. It's right here. It's the one under the coupler. Okay, that's called the brake pipe. These other 3 airlines, and there's 3 on the other side, but they're the same. You can hook them up when you hook up another locomotive to it. You can hook up either side. It doesn't matter. But just so you got to have at least one of each of these 3. All 3 of them have to be hooked up to the other locomotive. And these are air signals that the locomotive sends to the other locomotives in the consist. And they're called, the first one is the main reservoir. It's been a while. I mean, I've been retired for 10 years, so I might have a little trouble recalling which is which, but I know what the names of the 3 are. Main reservoir, that's all your pumped up air in your main reservoir that you're pumping up with your compressor, so they're all hooked together and have the same pressure in the main reservoir of air pressure. And the next one is the actuating, and the next one after that, the one all the way inside, is called the independent. The independent is the locomotive brake. All right, that's so when the engineer puts the locomotive brake on, all the locomotive brakes on will come on the other locomotives that are MU'd to it. So the actuating is, we'll just won't get too deep into that, but that's just so that when the engineer wants to release the locomotive brake, which was applied because he made a brake pipe reduction, which caused the locomotive brake to come on, he can keep the brake pipe, the rest of the train brakes on, but release the locomotive brakes by initiating the actuating valve on the independent. Now, what's called bailing off the brakes on the locomotive. That way, so if he's hooked to a train and he has the brakes on, he's sitting still, not moving, the train brakes are all on the cars, but he doesn't want the brakes to be on the locomotive for whatever reason, he can bail them off, and that way the brakes aren't on in the locomotive. And the main reason on that is so the wheels on the locomotive don't slide. When he puts the brakes on the train when he's moving, he doesn't want the brakes on the locomotives a lot of times for train handling, and so the wheels on the locomotive aren't sliding. He can bail the brakes off of the locomotive, and the brakes won't be applied to the locomotive. Okay, so that's pretty much the front end of the locomotive. These little handles here are to open up the coupler, the knuckle. All right. So if this was a real locomotive, of course, this part isn't hooked up on a model train, but that's how you open the coupler up when you want to disconnect from the other locomotives or the train cars. You push up on that. You push up. All right. On this one it doesn't. But anyway, that would have a pin going down here. This pin right in here somewhere when that's what they call pulling the pin. Did you pull the pin? That means you open the knuckle. The pin's pulled. So then you say you pull the pin on this knuckle, and then the engineer pulls away from whatever he's coupled up to, and that would open up the coupler so he could uncouple. So whenever you're uncoupling from another locomotive or another car, a train car, you have to pull the pin. All right, and you also have to close off the valves on these airlines. Now, whenever you hear two cars getting, in the real railroad world, two cars getting uncoupled from one another, you'll hear a big air go. It'll go, and that's because this airline, and if they're locomotives, these airlines as well, because they were connected to the other locomotive, are coming apart. Even though we close the valves off, this valve on the brake pipe would be up here. The valves that close the air off on these would be in here under the step. And we close those valves off, but we can't pull these airlines apart by hand because they're under pressure, and it would not be safe. And we couldn't do it anyway because there's so much pressure connecting this line to the other. The only way to do it is to just pull the pin and just pull the locomotive away from the other locomotive, and they will separate. They're made so that they won't break. They're made so that they will, like that. They'll come apart. When they come apart, they make that big air sound. So it'll scare you at first time you hear it, and you're not ready for it. So that's a little notation there on the airlines. Of course, this is the locomotive number. It's called the number board. You got the bell up here. You got the steps over here. The grab irons. This part here, okay, this plow, see how the front of the locomotive has this, it's like a snow plow here. Now the GP35, this engine did not, I don't know if they put those on there since then, but this model came with another, this is called the pilot. Okay, the front of the locomotive, the plate that runs down here is called the pilot. And these weren't curved up like that. They were just a straight pilot that was back here. Originally, maybe they did have these curved, and they all got so banged up that they just took them off then. But the Jeep 35, the 103, just had a straight pilot left on it that's put back here. So that's called the pilot. This is called the coupler. All right, now this coupler, by the way, you know, sometimes when they couple up to other cars or locomotives, they take a strong hit. I mean, they bang them together. So in order to keep things softened up a little bit so you don't feel the bang and so things don't get broken, underneath, this is connected way back in here to a spring pack. All right, and it's just a big pieces of rubber that are designed to take up the shock of the impact when you couple up to another locomotive or car or whatever. They can only absorb so much, you know. I mean, if you hit too hard, something's going to break, or you could derail because the locomotive will, you know, that force, that momentum of the locomotive moving and then coming hitting another solid stopped locomotive or train. So you have to couple up softly. But there is a shock absorber under there called a spring pack, and we would change these once in a while, and you have to take this pilot off here, and you unbolt the plate holding this up, and you drop them down. They drop down out the bottom. That's how you change the spring packs. Sometimes the knuckle itself, this part here, is removable by pulling this pin out right here, and the knuckles would get a crack in them or whatever, and you'd have to change those too. Those are pretty heavy stuff. All this stuff is heavy in real life. That's why you railroads don't have to worry too much about stuff getting stolen, because it takes more than one guy to carry anything off. People don't usually steal stuff because it takes too much, and it's not right to steal anyway, you know. But that's an old saying on the railroad: everything's too heavy. Even the tools are too big and heavy. and you can't use, they're kind of tools you can't use at home anyway. Speaking of tools, which it's carrying stuff home, this here, you guys, I wanted to show you this. This, you know how a car has a key? I got enough time left on this video to cover the, okay, yeah. Well, this is, the locomotives don't have a key, okay. What they do have is, I guess they consider this kind of the key because it's standard practice to pull this out of the slot that it goes in the engineer's seat. This is a reverser handle. When the locomotive engineer wants to make the locomotive go the other direction, this is the handle that he grabs and he pulls it back and it clicks into, if he wants to go backward, he pulls it back towards him. If he wants to go forward, you know, he pushes it in that direction. But when it's in the middle, it's in the neutral position, the locomotive won't go even if you throttle up. So when it's in the middle position, you can, and the throttle's down to 0 or notch, yeah, idle, you can pull this out. See how it's notched right here? And that would enable this to come out. Well, whenever a locomotive is sitting and unattended, they're going to get off of it and leave it, and they pull these out and just throw them up on the control stand like that. Sometimes they fall on the floor like that, and then the next guy has to try to find one. So everybody, most engineers will carry a reverser handle of their own in case there's not one there. Because if you don't have this, you're not going anywhere. This is like the key to the locomotive right here. And the engines that are MU'd to this one, you want to make sure you have those out and you throw them up on the control stand like that, because you don't want somebody to accidentally bump that into the direction that you're not going on a trailing locomotive. Locomotives, there's a lead locomotive, and then the other locomotives that are MU'd to this one that are called the trailing locomotives. All right. So that's the front of it. We'll get to the roof of the locomotive next.